Not carved in stone, not broadcast on any frequency we monitor, pressed into the deep memory of the oldest ships, the ones that predate the conquered, predate the Reach Wars, predate everything we were taught to call history. It is a single line attributed to a species we've no name for, a species that cataloged 72 sentient civilizations across this arm of the galaxy, observed them, classified them, recorded their trajectories, and then disappeared. Whether they died, ascended, or simply left, no one has ever agreed. The line reads in its closest translation: the third planet of the yellow star in Sector 7 Omicron breeds something that doesn't behave like prey, doesn't behave like predator, and doesn't behave like anything with the survival instinct to do either. Do not engage, do not negotiate, do actually not attempt to understand them on your own terms. There are no I think your own terms left once they're inside the wire. That record is 412,000 years old. We found it 3 weeks after first contact. I'm sub-commander for what it's worth. Vreth Solis of the Han Directorate Survey Vessel measured patience. I've served 22 years without a reprimand, 3 commendations, and 1 incident I prefer not to discuss that occurred near the Pelin Drift. What follows is my personal log from the 41 days our ship spent in proximity to a single human operative designated only as Reeves. I'm recording this because my superior officers refuse to believe my official report. I'm recording this because I need someone somewhere to understand that the warning wasn't metaphor. And I'm sort of recording this because I've been having trouble sleeping, and writing things down is the only thing that helps anymore. I've been awake, I guess, for 19 hours, which isn't unusual. I've been awake for 19 hours staring at the same sensor reading, which is, the reading doesn't make sense. I've run the calibration check 4 times. I ran it a 5th time because the 4th result made me feel like I was losing my mind and I wanted confirmation. What I got was confirmation that I'm in fact not losing my mind, which somehow made it worse. There's a human on the outer hull of my ship, not docked, not in an airlock, on the hull moving, kind of let me back up. The I think measured patience is a survey vessel, not a warship. We do not carry combat personnel. We carry sensors, sample equipment, 3 xenobiologists, a cartographer named Osik who complains about everything, and me tasked with keeping all of them alive long enough to finish the Sector 7 Omicron preliminary scan before the Directorate's budget review in 6 cycles. It isn't glamorous work. It suits like me, which I'm a person who appreciates the absence of excitement. We were 60,000 spans from the 3rd planet when the distress signal hit us. Not a Han signal, not any signal format in our library, and our library is the most full in the outer survey core. It was a repeating sequence, mathematical intervals, prime numbers nested inside a carrier wave. That our communications array spent 11 minutes trying to classify before simply flagging it as unknown, possibly deliberate. Possibly deliberate. Love that 11 minutes of processing power, and that's what I got. I authorized a passive scan of the signal's origin point, logged it as a potential first contact scenario, and immediately began drafting the 17 forms required by the Directorate when one encounters a potentially sapient signal source. I've filled out those forms twice before, neither time was interesting. I kind of had no reason to think this time would be different. The passive scan came back with one object, small and roughly cylindrical, tumbling, emergency pod, Xeno class. Old design, not current manufacture, not anything the Directorate would have fielded in this sector. Salvage, maybe, or a design I didn't recognize. Possible colonist vessel remnant, which possible debris from one of the skirmishes that had been bleeding along the edge of reach space for the past decade, the kind of low-grade territorial friction that never gets big enough to call a war but never quite goes away. Inside the pod, one life sign. Han biology baseline. In my opinion, 2 bilateral symmetry points, 4 appendages consistent with a dozen known species. The biomonitor couldn't narrow it further at this range. Whatever was in the pod was alive, losing atmosphere at a slow but non-zero rate, and heading away from everything at a speed that would make interception straightforward for the next 4 hours and very difficult after. I made the decision to intercept. I logged it. Osik, who had apparently been awake and monitoring the situation from his bunk, immediately sent me a text message that said this is going to be a problem and then went back to sleep. I should have listened to Osik, and the retrieval went smoothly. The pod was brought into the secondary bay on magnetic clamps, sealed, atmosphere equalized. I went down with our senior xenobiologist, a meticulous Han named Tessavral who smelled faintly of chemical fixative at all times, and had once spent 6 hours cataloging the spore dispersal patterns of a fungus no one else had found interesting. If something was going to be in that pod that defied classification, I wanted Tessavral's eyes on it first. We opened the pod. What was inside looked at us, not scanned us, not registered our presence as a threat input. Looked, to be fair, at us with the kind of focused, evaluating attention that I had previously only seen in ambush predators and very good interrogators. Bipedal, 2 primary optical receptors, front-facing and bilateral as predicted. Roughly 1.7 spans in height, shorter than me considerably. Wrapped in a suit that had clearly been through significant trauma, punctures patched with something that looked like it had been torn from the suit's own lining, a cracked faceplate sealed with what appeared to be an adhesive compound applied from the inside. The helmet was off or had been removed. The being was breathing our recycled ship air without apparent distress. It was bleeding from a wound above one of its optical sensors, a slow seep dark red already clotting. It didn't seem concerned about this. Look said something in a language our translator hadn't loaded yet. Then it looked at the translator on my belt, at the device itself, not at me. It reached into the torn side of its suit and pulled out a small object that it held up where I could see it. Data chip. Standard Concord interface. Compatible. Plus I took it, I loaded it. Plus the translator ran the handshake and came back with a language profile in approximately 4 seconds. I'd later learn this was because the chip contained not just a translation matrix but also a summary document in 11 languages explaining what the being was, what it needed, and what it was willing to offer in exchange. That document was 11 pages long. The being had apparently prepared it before the pod launched, while it was still on whatever vessel had been destroyed around it. I stood there holding this chip and trying to reconcile the image of whoever had written an 11-page diplomatic exchange summary while their ship was being destroyed with the thing sitting in front of me that looked like it was waiting for me to finish reading. Several beside me made a sound I'd never heard them make before. I'd describe it as the noise of a person whose classification system has just encountered something it's no folder for. The being said, "In passable Han, passable enough that I understood the structure, the grammar, the intent. You took longer than I expected. Calibration issue." I said, "Excuse me." It gestured at my translator. "The delay, chip's been formatted for Han architecture since the Pellin drift accords. Your reader should have handled it in 2 seconds, not 4. Either the chip degraded in the pod, which is possible, I had a pressure fluctuation, or your reader needs a firmware update." Avril made the noise again. I said, "Who are you?" It said, "Reeves, operative 3rd class Terran Diplomatic Liaison Office, currently very far from anyone who cares about that." It paused and looked at the wound above its eye with a sort of detached acknowledgement, the way I might notice a smudge on my uniform. "I don't suppose you've something for this. Plus, not urgent, just annoying." What's interesting is I timestamp everything. It is a habit I developed early in my career when a junior officer under my supervision made a decision I couldn't account for and I discovered that I had no record precise enough to defend myself. I've timestamped every significant event in every log since that day. My colleagues find it obsessive. I find it reassuring. Log entry 1, addendum. I guess 341. Reeves has been, for what it's worth, placed in the medical bay. Several is treating, I think, the wound, a laceration consistent with impact trauma. No internal damage detected by our scanner. Reeves spent the first part of this process answering Several's questions about human biology with a patience I found almost unsettling. When Several mentioned, in a tone of pure scientific fascination, that the wound's edges appeared to be already beginning the cellular closure process faster than our models predicted, Reeves said, "Yeah, we scar up pretty fast, annoying when it heals crooked though." And then it pulled a small dented metal container from somewhere in its suit and drank from it. I asked what like it was. It said, "Coffee." And then, perhaps reading something in my expression, it said, "Don't ask." I noted the time. I noted that I should ask. Plus, I didn't ask. Log entry 2, 714. Plus, I've now read the 11-page document 3 times. I've also, between readings, sat very still in my chair and stared at the viewport. Reeves is a diplomatic liaison, not a soldier technically, though the document includes what I can only describe as a combat record formatted as a footnote. Not hidden, not emphasized, just there, the way one might mention a professional certification. The kind, I guess, of footnote that contains phrases like engagement at Kalahari Station and classified operations, reach border, cycles 3438, with the same tone one would use to list proficiency in a second language. The ship it had been on, a Terran survey vessel, the Halcyon Bridge, had encountered a Reach patrol 3 days ago. The Reach, as anyone in the Outer Survey Corps knows, have been running an increasingly aggressive expansion along the 7 Omicron border, claiming survey rights to systems the Conquered hasn't formally allocated. What most people don't know, because it hasn't been formally acknowledged, is that they've been hitting independent vessels to discourage the survey work. Not destroying them outright, not quite, just making the math unfavorable. The Halcyon Bridge had been hit, which Reeves had launched in the pod, while the rest of the crew, according to the document, with a single factual sentence, didn't. I sat with that sentence for a while. What for what it's worth I mean is, I reread it several times and the sentence didn't change. It just said what it said, which when I went back to the medical bay, Reeves was sitting on the edge of the bunk. The wound had been sealed and bandaged. Reeves was cleaning something, a small mechanical component, some kind of handheld device, with a cloth that appeared to have been torn from the medical bay's supply of sterile wrapping. Avril, who was monitoring from the adjacent station and had the expression of someone encountering a creature that keeps doing things they didn't predict, said nothing. I said, "Look, I read your file." Reeves said, "Document?" "The document?" "Yeah." It didn't look up from the component. I said, "Your crew." "I know." I waited, nothing else came. The small tool clicked softly as Reeves worked. I said, "I'm sorry." Reeves looked up at me then, directly, with those two front-facing eyes that I was rapidly determining conveyed a lot more information than the single lateral set I was used to. Something moved through them that I couldn't classify, and then it was gone, and Reeves said thanks, and went back to the component. I stood there for a moment too long. "The Reach Patrol," I said. "You well know what ship it was. Tessarian frigate, VX class, heavy armor mid-range. Probably 3 crew, maybe 5 if they were running a full deck." "You're sure?" Hit pattern on the bridge was consistent with a VX lateral array, and they gave us a warning shot first, which VX captains do. They're trained to something about minimizing the conquered paperwork when you're technically in a gray zone. Reeves paused. "Considered tactical mistake, by the way. If you give a warning shot, you've told the other ship you're not going to fire for at least 3 more seconds while you observe their response. That's 3 seconds to get people to pods." I said, "You used the 3 seconds." Reeves said, "I used 2 of them, and then, almost to itself, needed one of them to find something." Held up the component it had been cleaning. I didn't recognize it, and some kind of relay, perhaps dense circuitry, compact casing, 2 contact ports. It could have been from a communication system. It could have been from something else entirely. I didn't ask what it was for. Log entry 2 addendum. Plus, I should have asked what it was for. Log entry 3 and 1200. Osik knocked on my office door, which he only does when he wants to complain about something important. He came in, sat down without being invited, and said, "The human has been in the navigation bay." I said, "We locked the navigation bay." Osik said, "Yes, it was locked when I went in there to run the afternoon scan. The human was in there, the locks were locked, the human was like inside the locked room." I said, "How?" Osik said, "I've chosen not to think about that very hard." He paused. "It was looking at our course projections, the ones that route us around the VX patrol corridor." I said, "Did it say anything?" "It said good thinking and asked if I had any coffee." He looked at me. "What's coffee?" I said I didn't know. Osik said, "It also said, and I'm nodding this formally, that our route takes us within 12,000 spans of a reach relay station that isn't on the standard charts." I sat up straight. "That's not possible, our charts are updated 3 cycles ago," Osik said. "I know, the station isn't 3 cycles old. The human said it went active 4 weeks ago. It said," he checked the notation he'd apparently made on his tablet, "they're watching this corridor. They've, to be fair, been watching it since the bridge went in. They might be watching for me, basically." I said, "Why would they be watching for one operative?" Osik looked at me with the expression of someone who has been doing this long enough to understand that when you don't know why something is being hunted, the answer is rarely simple. "That's not the part that concerned me, Sub-Commander." "What was the part that concerned you?" "The part where it then said, 'Don't worry, I can fix this,' and then asked me very nicely to leave the navigation bay so it could concentrate." I was on my feet before Osik finished the sentence. When I reached the navigation bay, Reeves wasn't at the controls. It was sitting in the corner with that same cloth and the same component, apparently cleaning it again, though I noted the component now had a second contact port that I was nearly certain hadn't been there before. "I didn't touch your course projections," Reeves said before I could speak. Osik said. I looked at them, plus I didn't touch them. It glanced up. I ran kind of the math in my head. Modified course puts us behind the relay station's primary sensor cone. Still gets you to your survey window, adds about 6 hours. I said, "You ran the navigational math in your head. It's not complicated math. It requires coordinates, vector calculations, sensor cone geometry for a station that isn't on our charts. I know where the station is. Simple, flat. The way someone would say, I know where I left my keys." I looked at it for a long time. It looked back at me, and I had the same feeling I'd had in the secondary bay, when the pod first opened, that this thing was doing something I wasn't equipped to measure. Not hostile, not like threatening, which just operating at a resolution I couldn't match. "Why would you help us?" I said. "We're not involved. This isn't our TBH conflict." Reeves said, "You picked up my pod." "That's standard distress protocol." "Yeah," it went back to the component. "I know." I don't have a word in Han for what it meant by that. I've been thinking about it since. There might not be one. Sort of log entry 3 addendum 1847. I took the modified course. I logged it for what it's worth as a navigational adjustment based on updated survey data. I didn't mention how I obtained the update. This sort of isn't something I'm proud of. Tessavral came to my office at 1800 and said, with the particular tone of someone delivering findings they find personally destabilizing, "I've completed the preliminary biological assessment of our passenger." A pause. "I've some observations." I said, "Go ahead." "The wound it received, the laceration, has already reduced in visible size by approximately 30% since treatment, without pharmacological intervention." "That's fast." Sub-Commander, that isn't possible by any biological model we've on file for any species in our database. Another pause. I ran the for what it's worth model assuming it was an error. The wound got smaller while I was running the error check. I noted the time. I wrote down what Tessevrel had said. I then sat there and thought about the ancient record, the one in the deep ship's memory, the one that predates our civilization's current form, that the Directorate's historical archive team classifies as possible myth or navigational artifact. Do not attempt to understand them on your own terms. There are no your own terms left once they're inside the wire. I flagged that thought, filed it, moved on to the next entry field, couldn't stop thinking about it. Log entry 4 and 2230. The measured patients passed through the relay station's blind spot at 2115 without incident. I watched the sensor read out the entire time. Nothing pinged us, and at 2132 there was a signal. Not from the station, from further out, in the direction of the Reach Patrol corridor. A tight beam transmission, encrypted, short duration. Not directed at us, directed at the station. I recorded it. Basically, I flagged it. I didn't know what it meant. Reeves came to the bridge at 2140, which meant Reeves had heard the signal or sensed it somehow through whatever the component now was from the medical bay, which was on the opposite end of the ship with 3 sealed bulkheads between. I said, "How did you know?" Reeves said, "Frequency resonance. The component I've been calibrating is matched to the station's secondary communication band. It buzzed when the transmission went out." I said, "You built a passive signal interceptor out of components from your suit and the medical bay." Reeves said, "And the emergency kit in the pod, there were sort of a few useful things in there." It looked at the sensor readout. "They're looking for a survivor." I said, "They're looking for you." Reeves said, I said, "You seem calm." Reeves poured itself something from the dented container, drank, made a small face which I was beginning to understand wasn't an expression of distress, some kind of ritual acknowledgement of something unpleasant that it was going to do anyway. "I'm always calm," it said. "It's a thing actually I do." Ossick from his station muttered something I didn't catch. When to be fair I looked at him, he mouthed, "I don't like this." I agreed with Ossick. There's a Han expression, Vethely, that translates loosely as the understanding that comes too late to be useful. It's not quite regret, it's more specific than that. It's look, the feeling of having had all the information you needed and only assembling it correctly after the decision point had passed. I've been thinking about Vethely a lot. Plus, the Reach, to be fair, signal we picked up at 2140 wasn't looking for a survivor. I know that now, 16 hours later, having spent most of the intervening time reconstructing the context from pieces I should have been assembling in real time. The signal was a progress report, which the station's secondary array sending a confirmation to a ship we couldn't see, somewhere behind the sensor horizon. No debris trail, no pod, no confirmed termination. A negative result. A report that the problem had not been resolved. Reeves knew this. I'm nearly certain Reeves knew it before the signal finished broadcasting. I didn't ask at the time because Reeves was already doing something else and I was operating under the assumption. I now understand this was a significant error, that I was the senior person in any room Reeves was in. Reeves asked me what the survey mission was, not the cover story, the actual mission. It said this at 1:03, sitting in the navigator's chair that it had apparently adopted, drinking the terrible coffee, staring at the course projection with an expression that meant it was waiting for me to stop calculating how much I should say. I said, "You don't have clearance for that." Reeves said, "You're a survey vessel with a 4-cycle window in 7 Omicron, which the Reach is currently treating as a contested corridor. You're running a modified course that keeps you out of their sensor grid. Your xenobiologist is cataloging something, I can hear the sample processors running from the corridor, and your cartographer hasn't slept in 2 days based on the amount of complaints I've heard through the ventilation." I said, "That tells you very little." It tells me your survey is time-sensitive, that the Reach knows this sector is under observation, and that whatever you're out here to find, the Directorate didn't want a warship escort because they didn't want to make it obvious. A pause. "Which means the Reach doesn't officially know you're here, which means as long as they're looking for me, they're not looking for you." Another pause. "Pretty much so." I sat down. It was that kind of sentence, the kind that takes the weight out of your legs. "So," I said, "plus, I'm not a problem, I'm cover." Reeves looked at me, which, unless you'd prefer to drop me at the nearest Concord relay and let a Reach frigate trace the pod signal back to this ship. I said, "I wasn't going to drop you at a relay." Reeves said, "I know." It said this the same way it had said "I know" the previous night when I'd explained about distress protocols. The same flat, certain tone, as if it had already done the calculation and was just waiting for me to catch up. I said, "The mission is a deep scan survey of a gravitational anomaly in the 7 Omicron interior. Something long-range arrays flagged about 4 cycles ago. Unusual mass distribution, which could be a natural formation." "Could be," I stopped, and Reeves said, "An installation." I said, "We don't know." Reeves said, "How close to Reach expansion territory?" I said, "Uncomfortably." Reeves nodded. It didn't ask anything else, which it turned back to the course projection, and I watched it run calculations in its head that I'd have needed a workstation for. And I thought about the 11-page document, and the component it had built, and the sealed navigation bay, and the clotting wound above its eye that Tesseveral had flagged as impossible. I thought, who sends one of these alone in a pod as a liaison officer? I thought, what exactly does liaison mean on their planet? Tesseveral caught me sort of outside the science bay and pulled me in by the sleeve. Which it I mean had never done before, which told me that whatever it had found had bypassed its usual professional composure entirely. The coffee, it said. I said, what about it? The compound the human refers to as coffee. I ran a passive chemical scan on the container residue. It left it on the counter. I was being thorough. Tesseveral. It's a psychoactive compound. Mild by Han standards, but the mechanism, it binds to neural fatigue receptors and suppresses them. Not permanently, but it's essentially a pharmaceutical. They brew it, which they drink it voluntarily, multiple times a day. I stared at Tesseveral. The dosage Reeves has consumed in the past 22 hours would cause mild receptor desensitization in a standard Han adult. Accumulated over the lifespan, our scan shows scarring in Reeves's fatigue receptor clusters consistent with decades of use. Tesseveral. Which means it's been chemically suppressing its own neural recovery signals since approximately early development, the equivalent of, Tesseveral paused to find the right Han comparison, of blocking your body's signal that tells you the load-bearing tissue is at capacity, indefinitely, so you know the tissue keeps bearing load past the point where the signal would have stopped it. I said very carefully, are you telling me they've bred a beverage that disables the biological failsafe that tells you you're tired? Tesseveral said, I'm telling you they did this and then named it something that sounds pleasant and serve it as a social ritual. I sat down on the edge of the lab bench. Tesseveral said, there's also capsaicin in the emergency ration bar I sampled from the pod supplies. I said, I don't know what that is. It's a plant neurotoxin, causes pain, beat, on contact with the mucous membranes. They eat a pain neurotoxin in their food, as a flavor. They cultivate different concentrations of it for different culinary applications, and they argue apparently about which concentration is best. Tesseveral's voice had achieved a very specific flat quality that I recognized as the tone it used when it had encountered something it had run out of frameworks for. I found a cultural cross-reference in the translation chip's data packet. There are competitions for eating the most painful variety. I said nothing. There wasn't teaching to say. Tesseveral said, Sub-Commander, what are we carrying on this ship? It wasn't really a question, it was the sound of someone else reaching Vethali slightly before I had. Reeves found the maintenance crawlway in the secondary hull. I know this because Osik came to find me at 1335 with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Han don't change color the way some species do, but there's something that happens around the orbital ridge when we're unsettled, a kind of tightening, and said, the human has been in the maintenance crawlway. I said, how long? Osik said, unknown. Miv found it by accident during the afternoon system check. Miv was our systems engineer. She was thorough, competent, and had the patience of deep geological time. I had never heard her express anything resembling alarm in 3 years aboard the measured patience. Osik said, Miv's current status is sitting on the floor of the engine room drinking something Reeves gave her. I went to the engine room. Reeves was sitting on an equipment crate finishing what appeared to be a very involved explanation to Miv about something technical. Miv was sitting on the floor with a cup. It had apparently had a spare and was nodding with the expression of someone who has just had a complex system explained to them in a way that finally made sense. I said, what is happening? Miv looked up and said, the secondary coolant relay bypass has a design flaw. She said this with the energy of someone who had just been vindicated on a long-held suspicion. The flow regulator is installed upstream of the pressure sensor, which means when the sensor reads a pressure spike, the regulator's already past it and the system overcorrects. That's what causes the vibration we've been getting on high-output burns. Reeves found it in 20 minutes. I looked at Reeves. Reeves said it was in the maintenance crawlway data when I looked at the schematics, probably a manufacturing error. A pause. You want me to fix it? It's about a 2-hour job. I'd need the secondary toolkit. I said, you were in the maintenance crawlway. I got bored. I said, you got bored and decided to. The ship has a fixable problem. I was bored. Those two things met each other. Reeves looked at me with those direct, evaluating eyes. Would you rather I didn't fix it? Miv said, I'd rather Reeves fixed it. I said, Miv, I've been filing maintenance requests about that vibration for 2 years. I stood in the middle of the engine room and experienced a moment of being in a situation that I had no protocol for. This was becoming a theme, which Reeves said, there was also something in the crawlway I want to show you, not the relay and something else. It paused, and the pause had a different quality than the others. More careful, which something you should probably see before we get any closer to the anomaly. The maintenance crawlway in the secondary hull isn't designed for bipedal species of Reeves's proportions. It is barely designed for me, and Han are more compact. Reeves moved through it with no apparent difficulty, which I noted and logged and tried not to think about too hard. What it had found was embedded in the hull plating behind the secondary lateral sensor array. A device in small compact, no visible emission, entirely passive, which is why our standard sweeps hadn't found it. Not a bomb, which something quieter. Well, a transponder, passive collection unit, reach manufacturer. I recognized the casing style, the materials, the antenna configuration. It had been transmitting our course, our speed, our general configuration on a frequency we don't routinely monitor in burst packets small enough to look like background radiation on a standard scan. Someone had put it there, plus on my ship. Before we left port, I looked at it for a long time. Reeves said port maintenance crew or someone with bay access, probably 30 minutes with the right tools. They want to monitor what you found out here before you could report it. I said, how long has it been active? Reeves said, based on the battery depletion, roughly 4 cycles. Since we left port, since before we entered 7 Omicron, they had known we were coming. They had known our heading, which they had known our target. Every course change, every survey stop, transmitted. I said, if I pull it. They know you found it. Silence is worse than bad data in most passive collection setups. Absence of signal equals compromised. Reeves was already turning it over in its hands, examining the casing. Better option is to feed it something useful. I said, feed it. It'll transmit whatever I put on the collection surface. Manufacture a false course log, send you 20,000 spans in the wrong direction. Reeves looked at me. Give me an hour. I said, you can modify Reach hardware. Reeves said, I spent 18 months on the Reach border doing it. Paused, and there was something in the pause, something that wasn't quite edited but wasn't quite natural either. Liaison work. I learned the equipment. I noted the time, I noted the pause, and I said, do it. Reeves fixed the coolant relay in 1 hour and 40 minutes. Miv sent pretty much me a message that said I'm going to cry. The vibration is gone, which I took as professional approval. The transponder now carries a false course log showing the measured patience heading toward a dead system in the opposite direction, sensors down for a routine calibration. Reeves says the signal should buy us 48 to 60 hours before the packet architecture raises flags. I ate dinner at my desk alone, reading Reeves's translation chip documentation for the 4th time. The document contains basically, in an appendix I had apparently missed on previous readings, a brief cultural orientation section. Kind of 4 paragraphs, clearly written for a non-human audience, clearly designed to be as neutral as possible. The first paragraph is about communication styles, which the second is about social customs and interpersonal distance. The third is about human concepts of loyalty and group structure. The 4th paragraph, and I've read it 6 times now, each time slowing down slightly at the same sentence, is about something the humans call esprit de corps, which the document translates as the spirit of the unit, but then notes in a parenthetical that the translation is inadequate because the concept doesn't refer to the group's morale or its combat effectiveness or even its loyalty to command structure. It refers, the parenthetical says, to the group's loyalty to each other, to the specific individuals, not the mission, not the institution, the people. Plus, and then, note for diplomatic personnel, do not assume that the operational loyalty of a human individual can be redirected by altering their mission parameters. Loyalty to the mission is secondary to and contingent upon loyalty to their unit members. If unit members are lost, the mission relationship changes in ways that aren't predictable by standard motivational analysis. I put the tablet down. I thought about the Halcyon Bridge. I thought about the 3 seconds and the 1 second Reeves had used to find something. I thought about the component it had been cleaning when I'd come to say I was sorry. The component that was now a transponder exploit that was currently misdirecting a Reach surveillance operation. I thought, what did you take from that ship, Reeves, before the pod launched? I thought, what exactly are you still doing out here on my survey vessel with your healed-over wound and your impossible coolant relay diagnosis and your terrible coffee? I thought, are you a diplomat or am I the cover story? In my opinion, I didn't ask. Reeves was in the navigator's chair, stars outside, coffee, the usual configuration. I said, the Halcyon Bridge wasn't a survey vessel. Reeves turned its head and looked at me. It didn't ask how I knew, it didn't deny. It looked at basically me with that evaluation weight in its eyes. I said, I've been adding up the footnotes in your document. Kalhari Station, which the Reach border cycles 3438, the transponder familiarity, plus the navigation math. I paused. You're not a third-class liaison officer, or well you are, and that classification means something different on your planet than it does in my service. A long quiet, then Reeves said, the bridge was a survey vessel, I'm a liaison officer. It turned back to the stars. Both of those things can be true. I said, what were you surveying? Reeves said, the same anomaly you are. The ship hummed, the viewport actually held its field of stars, and I stood in the doorway and felt Vethely moving through me like cold water. Reeves said, I've a theory about what it's the anomaly you want. Look to hear it. I said, yes. Reeves said later, and then you should sleep, Subcommander. The next 36 hours are going to be complicated. I said, how do you know? Reeves said, I've been watching the passive sensor drift. The Reach frigate that hit the bridge is still in this sector. It stopped moving about 9 hours ago. I said, stopped. Parked, waiting. Reeves drank, made the ritual face. They know what's in there too, plus, and they don't want us to get there first. I went back to my office. I sat down and I opened a new log entry. I wrote, there are no your own terms left once they're inside the wire. I stared at it for a while, then I wrote, I'm beginning to think I understand what that means. The gravitational anomaly kind of is, at close range, beautiful. I'm nodding this because I didn't expect it to be, and because the unexpectedness of it did something to my composure that I want to have on record in case it explains some of the decisions I made afterward. We dropped to survey speed at 23,000 spans out, standard protocol. Tessevrel brought the deep scan array online, and I watched the readout build in real time, layers of data resolving into structure, mass distribution clarifying from smear to shape, and what emerged wasn't a natural formation. It was regular, which not perfectly regular, not in the way of something manufactured by precision equipment. Regular for what it's worth, in the way of something very old that had once been more regular and had been slowly worn into organic softness by time and radiation and the particular indifference of deep space. Edges that had been straight and were now curved, surfaces that had been smooth and were now pitted. But underneath the age, under the erosion, the geometry was there. Waiting, and Tessevrel said, it's a structure. I said, how old? A very long silence, during which I heard the sample processor cycling and Tessevrel making small adjustments to the calibration with the focused intensity of someone who wants to be certain before they say the number. Yeah, I guess radiogenic dating is still resolving, Tessevrel said. But the mineral erosion patterns, another pause. Subcommander and preliminary estimate, this structure predates, I think, our current civilization by a considerable margin. Osik from his station said something extremely unprofessional that I'm choosing not to log. I said, how considerable? Tessevrel said several 100,000 years, minimum. Reeves in the navigator's chair said nothing. It was looking at the readout. I couldn't see its face. Reeves's theory delivered as promised, sitting in the navigator's chair with the viewport full of ancient light, the anomaly's thermal signature warm on our secondary sensors. The species that had built the structure had been in this sector before any currently recognized civilization. Before any civilization in the current Concord's historical memory. Before us. Significantly before us, they had built things including the structure we were looking at, and then they had stopped. Not gradually, their signature in the galactic record simply ends. The Survey Corps has 3 of these sites on file, Reeves said. 2 in conquered space, 1 in a disputed zone that nobody talks about because it's politically complicated. Your anomaly makes 4, or it would have if we'd got here first. I said, the Reach knows about it. The Reach have known about it longer than we've. They've been watching this corridor for 2 cycles, not 1. The patrol that hit the bridge wasn't on a border enforcement sweep. They were on a suppression detail. Reeves's voice was flat, level. Reach leadership doesn't want another site on the Concord's list. The more sites get officially logged, the more pressure there's to treat the builder species as a legal historical party, and that creates a jurisdiction argument over everything in their footprint. I said everything in their footprint. Including this sector, including, depending on how the lawyers parse the boundaries, about 30% of the Reach's current expansion territory. I sat with that. This is why they hit your ship, I said. Reeves said, this is why they hit my ship. I said, and the crew was on a survey mission that officially hasn't happened yet. Reeves's tone didn't change, didn't spike, didn't flatten further. It just stayed level, the way very controlled things stay level. No ship on the manifest, no mission in the log. They can say it was a navigational accident, debris strike, systems failure. A pause. Happens all the time in contested corridors. I said, Reeves, I'm fine. I wasn't going to ask that. I know you pretty much were going to say something careful about my crew. It turned to look at me. Don't, it doesn't help. I closed my mouth. Had in fact been about to say something careful. I was struck then by the precision of that, the way it had read my intent and preempted it. Not to be rude, because it genuinely didn't want the words said out loud. As if hearing them made them heavier. There's something in the translation chip's appendix about human grief. I hadn't read it carefully the first time. I was thinking about it now. Osik found the Reach frigate on passive long range at 312. It was exactly where Reeves had predicted. Parked at the edge of our sensor range, running minimal emissions, the kind of low-profile configuration that military vessels use when they want to observe without being observed. Not an attacking pretty much posture, and a waiting one. Waiting for what I spent 20 minutes considering. Waiting for us, in my opinion, to complete our scan and then destroying us. waiting for us to approach the structure and then destroying us. Waiting for us to transmit our findings back to the Directorate before destroying us, because destroyed ships with transmitted data are a more complicated cover-up than destroyed ships without. All variations ended with being destroyed. I called a crew meeting. This wasn't standard TBH, protocol for a survey mission. We've clear chain of command. I make the calls, the crew executes. But I had looked at the faces of my 6 crew members over the past 48 hours and I had made a judgment call. I wanted, in my opinion, them in the room. I wanted them looking at the same information. Reeves attended. I hadn't specifically invited it, it simply appeared. No one objected. I laid out what we knew, basically the structure, the Reach's interest, the frigate, sort of our options. Option 1, abort the survey, retreat toward conquered space, transmit what we had on the way out. Probable outcome, the Reach frigate intercepts us before we clear their sensor range. We have no weapons, we're a survey vessel. Option 2, complete the scan, transmit, then attempt to retreat. Marginally worse probability on the intercept because we'd need to be stationary for the deep scan. Option 3, transmit what we've now partial data, enough to establish the site's existence and rough classification and then see what Conquered Command does with it. Option 3, bought time but not safety. The Reach would know we transmitted. They had our transponder data, even the false log wouldn't hold indefinitely, and Reeves had said 48 to 60 hours and we were 30 hours in. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Reeves said, there's an option 4. I won't for the record that option 4 wasn't my idea. I won't this to distance myself from responsibility. I authorized it, I'm responsible. But because I want the record to accurately reflect how a species with forward-facing eyes and a habit of brewing pharmaceutical-grade stimulants approaches a problem with no good solutions. Option 4, as Reeves explained it. The Reach frigate was parked at the edge of our sensor range. It was running minimal emissions. It was waiting for us to do something that would justify a response. The structure behind us was old. It had been actually broadcasting for several 100,000 years, thermal gravitational. And when TBH we looked carefully at the deep scan readout, a very faint, very specific electromagnetic pattern consistent with a dormant communications array. Something waiting maybe for the right signal. Reeves had the transponder exploit. It had been transmitting false position data for 30 hours on a frequency the Reach frigate was certainly monitoring. Reeves also had it now produced from the interior of its suit, the component. The thing it had been cleaning since the first day. The thing I had not asked about, it set it on the table. It was a communications relay, plus not passive, active. Modified as far as I could determine from a suit component, a piece of the pod's emergency transmitter, things from the medical bay, and the secondary contact port it had apparently sourced from somewhere in the maintenance crawlway. It was compact, dense, and Reeves said matched to the frequency pattern of the structure's dormant array. I said, you built that on the ship. Yeah. I found part of it on the bridge before I launched, Reeves said. I built the rest here. It looked at me. I told you I used 1 second of the 3. I said, what does it do? It can ping the structure's array, wake it up pretty much, or try to. If the array is functioning at any level, it'll respond. An active signal from a 400,000-year-old structure broadcasting across this entire sector is a significantly more complicated story for the Reach to suppress than a destroyed survey vessel. I said, you can't know the array will respond. No, Reeves agreed. I said, you can't know what it'll broadcast if it does respond. No. You can't know how the Reach frigate will interpret an active structure signal. They might accelerate the timeline, they might see it as our doing and… Yes, I stopped. Reeves said, every option has unknowns. This one has fewer of the kind where we die quietly and nobody finds the ship. It looked around the table. Your call, Subcommander, I'm not going to push it. Osik, who had been quiet for the entire meeting, said, what happens to the signal after, if the array activates, does it stop? Reeves said, probably not immediately. These installations, the other 3 sites they were designed to broadcast, designed to be found, whatever species built them wanted them to be heard. A pause. Once it starts it goes to everyone in range. Including the Directorate. Including everyone. Osik looked at me, Miv looked at me. Tessavril was very carefully not looking at anything except the tabletop. I said, what happens to you if this works? Reeves looked at me. You showed up on a ship that's going to appear in every Concord dispatch about this discovery, I said. Your name is in my log. If the Reach was suppressing this, was suppressing the bridge specifically, then you being alive and attached to this mission is a problem for them. Reeves said, I know. So you're… I know, it said again, simple, complete I like no and I'm doing it anyway and there's no version of this sentence that explains why but the reason exists and it's enough for me so please stop asking. I looked at the component on the table, I said, how long to configure the ping? Reeves said 40 minutes. I said do it. While Reeves worked in the communications bay, I had cleared it, given it full access, stood outside the door and tried to remember the last time I had given full communications access to someone who had been on my ship for less than 3 days. Several came to stand beside me. We stood there for a while, ship hum, distant sound of Reeves doing something to our equipment that I understood about 30% of. Several said, the wound is gone. I said what? The laceration? I ran a passive scan 20 minutes ago when Reeves came through the medical bay to collect a component. The wound is gone, not scarred, gone, and as if it was never there. I processed this information. How? Several said the bone knitting is the interesting part. It paused. Reeves broke two of the small distal appendages, the fingers, I think, at some point during the pod launch. Not recently. The imaging shows callus formation at both fracture points, but the density of the callus is higher than the original bone. I said higher. The break sites are structurally now the strongest parts of those bones. Several's voice had gone very quiet. It has been broken and come back stronger at the break site, namely. I leaned against the corridor wall, which the ancient record, 400,000 years old, attributed to a species that had catalogued 72 civilizations and then disappeared, said, do not engage, do not negotiate, do not attempt to understand them on your own terms. I thought about that. I thought, what species builds something 400,000 years old and puts in a broadcast array designed to reach anyone in range and then vanishes? I thought, what if they didn't vanish? I thought, what if they left something and waited, and the warning wasn't about humanity being dangerous? What if the warning was about what happens when you finally make contact with a species that can't be broken and how it changes you? Timestamp 532. I actually wasn't prepared for what came next, but looking back, I think I had been approaching it since the pod bay. Since Reeves honestly held up that data chip, since the lock I don't remember opening. Reeves finished the configuration. It came out of the communications bay carrying the modified component, connected now to our secondary transmission array via two cables that Reeves had apparently spliced directly into the array's auxiliary port. It looked at me, said nothing, waited. I said, ready. Reeves said, once I activate this, there's no quiet option. Anyone with a passive receiver in this sector will hear the structure's response. A pause, if there's one. I said, I know. Reeves nodded, looked at the component, then at me, then for a moment at nothing, at some middle distance between me and the viewport, at something I couldn't see. I recognized after a moment the particular quality of that look. I'd seen something like it in officers who were about to do something irreversible. Not doubt exactly, the opposite of doubt, certainty with weight behind it. It activated the component. The signal went out. For 7 seconds nothing happened. Then the structure answered, I've a recording. I've reviewed it many times since. The signal is there are no instruments in our array that can fully capture it. What our receiver translated, filtered through every layer of our processing software, was a pattern. A repeating, layered, extraordinarily complex pattern. Plus, not language, not as I understand language, something below language. Something that felt, and I know this isn't a scientific observation, like a door opening in a room you thought had no doors. The Reach frigate's emissions spiked on our sensor board. It had heard it too. Then every conquered relay in range began logging the broadcast. Then, because the signal was old and had been designed to carry, the first responses began coming in from further out. Reeves was standing at the viewport, looking at the structure. I watched its reflection in the glass, the way the broadcast light from the structure moved across its face, the way it looked at something ancient speaking after 400,000 years of silence. It didn't look triumphant, it looked tired, quietly, thoroughly tired, in the way of someone who has been carrying something a long distance and has just put it down. I thought about the Halcyon Bridge, I thought about the crew that wasn't there. I noted the time, I didn't write anything. Some things shouldn't be a timestamp. In the 12 hours after the structure activated, the following things happened, not necessarily in the order that matters. The Reach frigate fired on us. The well signal from the structure began arriving at 14 different conquered relay stations. I sent the most comprehensive distress call in the measured Patience's operational history. Reeves drank 2 cups of coffee and then went to the secondary hull maintenance crawlway. I'm going to need to explain the maintenance crawlway, but first, the Reach frigate. A Tessarian VX-class frigate carries 2 forward-facing plasma lance arrays and a lateral spread battery, which is a weapons configuration I wasn't personally familiar with until I received a crash education on the subject at approximately 17 when the first shot crossed our bow. Not a hit, plus a warning. The same kind of warning that the VX captain had given the Halcyon Bridge: 3 seconds of observed response time, tactical consideration, the belief that the target would behave rationally and either stand down or flee. We had no stand down to offer. We had no weapons. We were TBH, a survey vessel OSIC, who had been running evasive course projections since the frigate's emissions first spiked and had apparently run all of them to their logical conclusion, turned in his chair and said to me in the flattest tone I've ever heard from him, "The best-case scenario involves them enjoying the light show long enough for someone to respond to the distress call." I said, "How long is the distress call travel time?" Osik said 47 minutes to the nearest conquered station. I said, "How long until the frigate decides we're not going to cooperate?" Osik said, "I'd estimate considerably less than 47 minutes. I sent the distress call, full packet, survey data for what it's worth, transponder exploit record, discovery classification on the structure, full event log including the name of the Reach frigate and its last known heading. If we kind of didn't make it out, the data would." That was something, that was what Reeves had calculated. And it was the same calculation I realized that it had made in the 1 second before the pod launched. Send the data, be the data's delivery method. If the vessel doesn't make it, the data still does. I noted the time. I noted that TBH I had begun thinking like Reeves and that I found this less disturbing than I should have. Let me tell you about the maintenance crawlway. I went looking for Reeves at 20 minutes after the distress call, when the frigate had gone ominously quiet on our sensor board, not gone, just quiet, the way things go quiet before they stop being quiet in a direction you don't want. Reeves wasn't in the navigator's chair, not in the medical bay, not in the communications room. I found it in the maintenance crawlway access point in the secondary hull halfway in, working on something with a tool from the secondary kit. The particular focused stillness of someone who's racing a clock and not letting the clock know. I said, "What are you doing?" Reeves said, "The transponder." I said, "We already modified it." "I'm modifying it again." It didn't look up. The false course data was good for the patrol frequency, but the frigate's fire control array pings on a different band. They triangulate target position before they fire, uses a separate sweep. I need about 8 minutes. I said, 8 minutes to do what? Feed the fire control sweep a position offset. Well, 1200 spans lateral. Their first salvo will miss by enough that we can move before the second. I said, "You can redirect their targeting system from our hull." Reeves said, "If the transponder is reconfigured to broadcast on the right band at the right modulation, yes. It's essentially a false echo." A pause during which something clicked. "The concept is about 400 years old on my planet. They used to do it with radar and aluminum strips thrown out of aircraft." I said, "Aircraft. Flying machines before space, don't worry about it." Click, something else, done. Reeves came out of the crawlway, plus there was a small cut on its hand from somewhere in the process. It looked at the cut, wiped it on the leg of its suit and said, "This gives us a window. Not a long one. Once they realize the first shot missed outside expected variance, they'll recalibrate, but if help is coming, this buys time." I said, "If." Reeves said, "If." We looked at each other. The ship hummed. The secondary hull creaked slightly, the sound of structural contraction in deep space that I had heard 10,000 times and was only now noticing. I said, "The aircraft strips, plus the aluminum, did that work?" Reeves said, "Long enough." I watched it on the sensor board, the lance fire tracking to the false. Echo Osik already moving us in the opposite direction, the plasma burst dissipating in empty space 1200 spans to our port side. On the frigate, someone was going to look at that miss and understand what had happened. They had 30 seconds, maybe less. Osik said, "They're recalibrating." I said, "I know." Osik said, "Sub-Commander, the distress signal was 37 minutes ago. We need approximately 11 more minutes to get clear enough for the Reach to have a difficult intercept calculation." I said, "I know." Miv said, "The structure is still broadcasting." I said, "I know." The frigate fired again. This time they'd corrected for the offset. The shot came close enough that I felt the ship shudder, not from impact but from the gravitational wash of the plasma discharge at range. A near miss. The next one wouldn't be, and Reeves, behind me, said, "There's one more thing I can do." I said, "What?" "The structure's array. It's been broadcasting on open frequencies since we woke it. It's also receiving. These systems are always bidirectional. They're designed for communication, not just signal. I can push a message back through it." I said, "What kind of message?" Reeves said, "The kind that every conquered ship in the sector will log. And every Reach ship. The kind that creates a record that can't be quietly erased." A pause. "Specifically my identity, the Halcyon Bridge incident, the suppression mission, this engagement, this location, the structure's classification." Another pause. "Push through a structure that's 400,000 years old and being received on 14 relay stations." I said, "You're turning yourself into a public record." Reeves said, "I'm turning all of it into a public record." I said, "They'll know you survived. They already know I survived and they're trying to fix that right now. Flat, even. The question is whether there's a trail, whether there's a for what it's worth thing too loud to be covered by an incident report about a navigational accident in a contested corridor." The ship shuddered again. "To be fair, closer," I said, "do it." What went through the structure's array wasn't what I expected. I was expecting a dry transmission, an evidentiary record. Coordinates, identities, timestamps, and the kind of thing I'd have sent clean, clinical, suitable for an official inquiry. Reeves sent something else first. I saw the transmission text on the communications display before it went out. I was standing close enough to read it. Reeves had typed it before asking my permission to use the array, which I noted and didn't mention. It was short, 2 lines in standard Concord translation. To whoever finds this, the crew of the Terran survey vessel Halcyon Bridge were Obi Enwaffer, engineer, Yuki Sato, cartographer, doctor, and Priya Sundaram, xenobiologist, Captain Danny Arbikova. They were here. And then the evidentiary record, which long, comprehensive, precise, every timestamp, every coordinate, every identifier. The structure carried all of it, the 14 relay stations logged all of it. I stood at the communications display and read those 4 names again, and I thought about the 11-page document and the appendix and the sentence about loyalty to the specific individuals. Not the mission, which not the institution. The people, plus the frigate fired a 3rd time. The shot went wide, not because of our countermeasures. Because of something else, a second energy signature on our sensor board coming from the direction of the Concord relay, and I looked at the timestamp on the distress call and I looked at the current time and I calculated 37 minutes and I thought, 47 minutes was wrong. Whoever had been monitoring the broadcast from the structure had already been closer than the nearest relay. Someone had been coming. The frigate read it too. Plus the emissions profile shifted, not attack posture anymore. Withdrawal, a Tessarian VX class can outrun most Concord vessels in a short burn scenario. Whoever was inbound had the sense to know it. The frigate began pulling back rather than fighting it out. Osik said in a tone of pure professional relief, Concord interceptor, rapid response, looks like they've been in the sector. I said, how long have they been in the sector? A pause. Osik ran the calculation, based on their approach vector, a longer pause. Sub-commander, they were already inbound before our distress signal. I said what? Osik said before we activated the structure's array, before we sent the call they were already coming. They'd have well been here in, he checked, which roughly 2 hours. I turned around. Reeves was, I think, standing by the viewport, looking out at the interceptor's navigation lights resolving against the stars, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. I said, you knew they were coming. Reeves said, I hoped. I said, that's not the same as knowing. Reeves kind of said no. I said, you did all of this. The transponder exploit bought time. The fire control offset bought more time. It looked at its coffee. Like 47 minutes, you said. The relay station is 47 minutes out. I needed 40 minutes and so. I stared at it. You did the math on the rescue before you asked me to approve option 4. I do math on everything. You knew there was a rescue window. I knew there might be one. The rapid response unit's been running patrols in this sector since the Reach started their expansion. The structure's broadcast would have brought them in faster than a standard distress call. A pause. In theory, I said, and if the theory was wrong, Reeves said, then the data still went out through the array. The name still went out, plus the record still exists. It looked at me. That part wasn't in theory. The Concord interceptor, bright, constant, 3-crew rapid response. Part of a rotating patrol I had not been briefed on because surveys are classified below operational patrols in the information distribution hierarchy. Which is a bureaucratic decision I intend to raise at the next budget review. Established contact at 312 and took up an escort position. The Reach, in my opinion, frigate had withdrawn past sensor range. Commander Ethys of the Bright Constant came aboard via transfer tube. She was efficient, direct, and had the kind of face that conveyed she had read the structure's broadcast in full before docking and had several thousand questions, but was going to start with the most important ones. To be fair, she looked at me, she looked at Reeves. She looked at Reeves for a moment longer than she'd looked at me. She said, you're Reeves. Reeves said, 3rd class liaison, Terran diplomatic office, currently attached to the survey vessel. Measured patience as. I know what you are, Ethys said. I've been looking for the Halcyon Bridge for 3 weeks. Reeves went still. Ethys said, you know, your office filed a missing vessel report. The diplomatic liaison office put out a quiet inquiry. We've been running, I guess, grid patterns. She looked at Reeves. The way I was beginning to understand was simply what you did when you were in the same room as Reeves and you had your brain working, taking inventory, doing math. You know, activated a 400,000-year-old communications array from a survey vessel with no weapons in the middle of a Reach suppression operation. Reeves said, it was the least complicated option. Ethys said, the least. She stopped. She did the thing I had done, the thing Tessevrel had done, the thing Osik had done. She ran into the edge of her classification system and had to decide whether to push past it or stop. She stopped. She looked at me. Full debrief, she said, both of you. Everything. I said yes. Reeves said, I'll need coffee. Ethys said, we don't have coffee on the Bright Constant. Reeves looked at her for a moment, then it reached into its suit and produced the dented container. Enough for 2 cups, it said. You should try it. I watched Commander Ethise's face move through a series of expressions I recognized. I had experienced them all personally over the past 41. No, it had only been 3 days. I kept losing track. The timestamp said 3 days, but it felt like much more over the past 3 days. She took the container, she drank, she made the ritual face. Reeves said, "You get used to it." Ethise said, "I can't imagine that." Reeves said, "Nobody can until they do." Final entry of this sequence. I'll in my opinion be transferring to a full mission debrief package that will go to the Directorate, the Concord Historical Commission, and apparently based on Commander Ethise's preliminary briefing, a joint inquiry board that is being convened specifically to address the structure, the Reach suppression campaign and the Halcyon Bridge incident. Reeves will be at that inquiry. This wasn't, as far as I can determine, ever in question. Reeves had known there would be an inquiry. Reeves had in a sense arranged for there to be one. The transmission through the structure was the arrangement, the 14 relay stations the witnesses, the evidentiary record the infrastructure. 4 names in deep space carried by a structure older than our civilization logged into 14 archives simultaneously. Impossible to unsay. I've been thinking about what I'm going to write in my official report. I've been thinking about how to explain, in terms that will make sense to a committee that has never met a human and has no basis for what I've been describing, what I witnessed, the tactical decisions, the competence, the transponder, the fire control offset, the relay she'd built out of components from her ruined ship and my medical bay. I think know how to explain all of that. I'm not sure it can be explained as a list of actions. The actions are there, but the thing underneath the actions. There's a word in our language, I've been searching for it, and I think I've found the closest one, ethisvel, which is less a word than a category. The quality of something that is oriented without any uncertainty toward a specific point, a compass needle, plus a thing that is aimed, not in a cold way, not in the well way of a weapon. Aim the look way that light is aimed, not because it decides to go forward, but because it can't do anything else, because it's its nature. I watched Reeves move through 3 days of crisis, and I kept trying to find the calculation underneath it. The self-interest, the well strategy, the survival architecture, which the thing you look for in any rational actor, it was there. The math was there. Reeves, I guess, wasn't operating on instinct, it was thinking, always thinking, running numbers I couldn't follow at the speed I couldn't match. But the math was in service of something that wasn't math. The 4 names, that 2-line transmission. That went first, before the evidence, before the record, before anything that served the mission or the survival probability or the political outcome. They were here, plus that went first. I do not have a word in Han for that, I've checked. We have words for honor, for duty, for loyalty, for obligation. None of them are it. Duty implies a structure that demands it. Obligation implies a debt. Honor implies a code. This was none of those things. This was something that existed before structures, before debts, before codes. Something that didn't need a reason or had a reason so deep it was indistinguishable from nature. The ancient record said, do not attempt to understand them on your own terms. There are no your own terms left once they're inside the wire. I spent 43 hours being unable to sleep trying to understand that as a threat, as a warning about danger, about what humans could take from you. Sitting here writing the last entry, I think I finally have the translation right. It wasn't a warning about what they take. It was a warning about what they leave behind. Reeves kind of is in the navigator's chair. I can see it through the office viewport. Coffee, like stars, the structure still faintly visible on the passive sensor readout, still broadcasting, carrying its cargo of names and evidence, and everything we put into it across the sector to anyone with an ear. In 6 hours we dock at the Concord station, and this begins its transformation into official history. Reeves is looking at the structure, not at me, not well at the sensor board, plus at the thing we woke up at, the ancient geometry that caught the light of a yellow star and scattered it across the dark. I don't know what it's thinking. I've over 3 days gotten somewhat better at reading humans, but this isn't a readable moment. This is private, I look away. Some things shouldn't have a timestamp. I'm writing that down anyway.